Welcome to the art and science of mead. What is mead? And the history and styles of mead. What is mead? I can't tell you how many times I've been in a social situation and someone heard that I made mead and they thought that they were talking about meat. They thought I was excited about being a butcher, and though that's certainly important, we're talking obviously about mead with a letter D and not meat. So, what exactly is mead? Simply put, it's wine made from honey. This is a concept that a lot of people who are unfamiliar with mead have some difficulty understanding. I remember I poured a orange blossom sparkling traditional mead for someone, and she asked me, well, what type of grapes did you use to make this wine? It's delicious. I said, I didn't use grapes at all. I used orange blossom honey. And she said, that's a variety of grape I've never heard of before. The truth is a little bit more complicated than that. To be sure, mead is made with honey. Chemically speaking and fermentation-wise, mead is much more like wine than it is like beer, although there certainly is overlap, especially with certain styles, such as braggot, for example. Commercially, mead making is regulated by the feds as a wine, but the truth is there's more types of mead than there are types of beer and wine put together. I think one of the things that attracted me so much to mead first was that as a fermentation artist, I realized that pretty much anything I could think of, I could make as a mead. Anything that you can find as a beer, or as a wine, or as a hard cider, you can make that as a mead, as well as make your own mead that is none of those. There are meads made with only honey, water, yeast. There are meads with fruit, vegetables, spices, herbs. Pretty much anything you can think of that sounds good potentially could be made into a mead. I really like this diagram. It shows the overlap between mead and wine and beer. And as you can see, it might be a little bit challenging to determine simply by tasting, is this a honey beer or is this a braggot? Is this a fruit wine with honey or is this a mellow? Now, some have proposed defining mead as an alcoholic beverage with at least 51% of the fermentable sugars come from honey. And I think that's a very valid rule, most especially if you're talking about commercial mead. As you might imagine, it might be unfair for a winery to make something that they call honey wine or mead, but yet they use only a very small percent of the source of the fermentable sugar from honey, because it might be more economical to use more of the fermentable sugars as something else, for example, table sugar. Of course, if you're entering mead into a competition, the judges are not going to be able to tell based on what is in the glass exactly how much of the fermentable sugars came from honey. What we're looking for is honey expression, so the aroma, the flavor from the honey. So you could see how it might be possible that if you used a strong honey, a strongly flavored, strong honey with strong aroma, such as buckwheat, it might be easier to achieve that honey expression, even though you didn't actually exceed that 51% rule. On the other hand, you could use a whole lot of a honey that has a less pronounced character, such as clover or alfalfa honey, and there might not be very much honey character at all. Now, as a home brewer, you're not going to be held to the 51% standard, but I'm a beekeeper also, so my own personal philosophy is such that I believe that mead should be made with the fermentable sugars that are mostly from honey. And so that's what I try to do when I'm making mead, both for my own enjoyment or if I'm going to plan on entering it into a competition. Well, before we get into the styles and categories of mead, I think we do need to review a little bit of the background and history of mead. Every person who I talk to, almost every person who I talk to about mead, the first thing that they think of are the Vikings. Now, to be sure, the Vikings and other Northern European tribes certainly enjoyed their share of mead. And this is why many people who are not familiar with mead or all that knowledgeable about it, one of the first things they think of is the Vikings. Mead was mentioned in part of Norse mythology. Heiderin was Odin's magical goat, which produced mead for the warriors of Valhalla. We used to have milk goats, but we never had one that produced mead, but I would sure enjoy having a goat like that. Mead was also mentioned in Beowulf and other poems. So a lot of people, when they think of mead, they think of Vikings. And that's wonderful. But I've had people who were not that familiar with mead argue with me and tell me things such as, well, the Vikings were the ones who invented mead, or the Vikings were the only ones who ever enjoyed mead. And that's certainly not true. Pretty much anywhere in the world where human beings had access to honeybees and thereby had access to honey, also made some type of fermented alcoholic beverage that was made with that honey. For example, in Ethiopia, tej is a traditional mead, and it dated back many hundreds of years in writings, and possibly very likely earlier than that. You have to remember, even before humans knew how to keep bees, we were honey hunters, and we can find archaeologic evidence of people hunting and collecting honeycomb from wild bees. This still goes on today in certain parts of the world. Here they are collecting the combs from the migratory giant honeybee, Apis dorsata. The honey sometimes can have hallucinogenic properties because of where the nectar is collected from the bees. I don't know that they're making mead out of this, but this is something that's been going on for many thousands of years, even before there was recorded history. And it's very likely that mead was being made, some type of alcoholic beverage, including honey, was being made at that time. The challenge, though, is finding archaeologic evidence to prove how long ago it was that mead first began being brewed by people. The oldest archaeologic evidence that we have for mead being made was found by Dr. Pat McGovern. These were pots found in China that dated back 9,000 years ago. They chemically analyzed the clay and found that there was an alcoholic beverage fermented in these pots that consisted of rice, honey, and fruit. And so this is evidence of the first mead that is thought to be the oldest fermented alcoholic beverage. Of course, finding archaeologic evidence can be difficult because if someone was fermenting in, say, some type of watertight basket or in a dry gourd, those type of fermentation vessels would have no archaeologic evidence because they're not going to be able to be found. They're going to just basically decompose. Mead kind of went out of style for many years when people began learning how to grow grapes and how to make beer out of grain malt, such as barley. But recently, mead making has experienced a resurgence, particularly in the United States. Other countries, for example, Poland, mead actually never went out of style. There's a strong tradition of mead making. But in the United States, it really has become quite popular, and the amount of commercial mead production has increased rather remarkably. Even though wine and beer have remained relatively flat, the amount of mead that's being made increased by much higher amount than any of the other alcoholic beverages. So there are many who believe that mead is the smallest and yet fastest growing segment of the entire U.S. alcohol business. Okay, well that's enough on the history of mead. Let's get into the styles of mead. So most of this presentation was taken directly from the Beer Judge Certification Program guidelines. I'm a certified BJCP mead judge myself, and I feel pretty strongly about trying to understand these guidelines. Now, obviously, if you're a home brewer and you have absolutely no intent of ever entering a competition, it probably doesn't really matter what you call your mead or what style you think it is. If what you make tastes good to you, and you and your family and friends enjoy it, then it doesn't matter whether you decide whatever style you think that it should be in. If you're going to enter competitions, however, I strongly encourage you to look up these guidelines. There's a lot of questions on some of the social media and other forums about what style of mead is this? What category should I enter it into in the upcoming competition? And these guidelines are very specific, so the answer will be within these guidelines. And they're freely available online. And the only other thing I want to point out is this presentation I made, and if there's any errors or any things that are not consistent with the BJCP guidelines, that's entirely my own fault or my own responsibility. So if you have any questions at all about where an entry belongs, I recommend looking up the guidelines and reading them so that you can know which category you should enter that mead. When we talk about styles or categories of mead, we categorize them based on levels of sweetness, levels of carbonation, levels of alcohol, and what other ingredients might be used in addition to the honey. And sweetness, carbonation, alcohol, that'll be included in any of the categories of mead, no matter whether it's a traditional, melomel, piment, or whatever. So the levels of sweetness range from dry to semi-sweet to sweet. And even though they have the final gravity here or the residual sugar, I want to point out this is really perception-based. So if you taste a mead that may measure sweet in residual sugar, but there has a lot of acid, it may actually seem less sweet, and you might actually enter that into the semi-sweet category. Even though you know the residual sugar is high enough to enter it as a sweet mead, the judges won't know that. We only judge what's in the glass. And so there can be a lot of overlap between these styles, and that's why the judges try to be understanding. If it's sort of on the fence, we're not going to really take off a lot of points. I mean, obviously, if you enter it into the dry category and it's clearly very sweet, that's going to be a problem. But the relative sweetness of mead is determined really more by perception than the direct measurement, because there's so many factors that can affect it. Carbonation is another thing. That can make a semi-sweet mead seem more dry as compared to if it were still. You have levels of carbonation. So still mead has no carbonation, although there's a few tiny little bubbles. That's not a problem. Sometimes if you're sending an entry up to another elevation, there can actually be some carbonation coming up due to, say, opening the bottle at a higher elevation. There's pétillant, which is slight carbonation. It's not petulant. We do not call it that. It's not a moody, irritable teenager. And pétillant is between still and between sparkling. So it might be lightly sparkling, or it might just have a tingle or prickle on the tongue when you are having your mouth, but you don't see a lot of bubbling when it's in the glass. And then finally, there's sparkling meads, which are highly carbonated. They shouldn't be gushing out of the bottle, but they should have a character ranging from being very bubbly, like a champagne or carbonated water, or even a soda. Again, there can be some overlap in what some might call sparkling, others might call pétillant, and so on. And then finally, we also distinguish, no matter what category of mead it is, we distinguish between the levels of alcoholic strength. So you can have a hydromel, session strength mead, which is low alcohol. This would be analogous to the alcohol content of a beer, or maybe a hard cider, or perhaps a wine cooler. You have standard strength mead, which is similar in alcoholic strength to table wine. And then finally, you have sack strength mead, which is the higher alcohol mead. And this is more like a high alcohol wine or maybe a liqueur. Now, if you're reading through the BJCP guidelines, there's what they call the standard description for mead. And these are what we use to describe every style. These are not a category or style per se. You're not going to enter them into a different category based on these attributes. But every style, no matter what category you're talking about, will talk about appearance, aroma, flavor, mouthfeel, and then overall impression. How well do all of these work together? Do they fit? Is there balance? Is it pleasing in the glass? And if you're judging or if you're entering competitions, the judges will discuss all of these different characteristics and then score your mead on all of these put together. Let's talk about the different styles of mead. So category M1 is traditional, mead made with honey, water, yeast. If it doesn't have anything else, then that's what a lot of folks call a show mead. Show mead is not a separate category. It would be entered under the traditional mead category. But there's other ingredients that are allowed, such as nutrients, acid, tannins, oak, sulfites, anything else that you would. But basically, a traditional mead is honey, water, yeast with these other ingredients. And there's some subcategories too. M1A is a dry traditional mead. M1B is a semi-sweet traditional mead. And then M1C is a sweet traditional mead. And again, you don't have to know the BJCP category if you're only going to be making it for your own use. Just know what a traditional mead is. Another popular category is the melomel category. Category M2, it's made with fruit or fruit juice. And there's some subcategories such as Sizer, which is a mead version of hard cider, or a Piment, which basically is a mead version of red wine or white wine. It's a mead made with grape juice. In the melomel or fruit mead category, there are the berry melomels, M2C, and these are made with berries or berry juice. Very popular category. These are very delicious when you have a really upfront berry aroma and flavor, or a berry bomb, as many of us call those. Stone fruit mead, another popular one. Peaches, apricots, cherries, and one that maybe you don't really think of is mangoes. You typically think of a mango as a tropical fruit, which is what it is, but it does have a big, large pit. So that would be entered into the stone fruit mead category. And then finally, there's the melomel, which is a mead made with any other fruit that doesn't fit into the other categories mentioned above. So that could be citrus, tropical fruits other than mango, or combinations of various different types of fruit. Then there's what we often call the metheglin, which is a spiced or herbed mead. M3A, fruit and spice mead, that would be one that's made with a fruit as well as a spice. Here we have strawberries and a jalapeno pepper. It could be any fruit and anything that would be considered herb or spice. There's M3B, which is a spice, herb, or vegetable mead. So anything that contains spices, herbs, or vegetables, but not a fruit, because then it would be in category M3A. And the important distinction is the culinary, not the botanical definition is used. For example, a tomato is botanically, technically, the fruit of the tomato plant, but culinary-wise, we consider it a vegetable. And so if you're entering a competition and you have to say, well, technically, the tomato is a fruit, well, yes, that's scientifically correct. But when you're entering into a competition, it would be best entered within the spice, herb, vegetable category. And then finally, we have the specialty mead category. And so this includes M4A, which is a braggot. Some people spell it differently, such as bracket. It's basically a mead version of beer. And it can range in any style of beer that you think could be made. You could make a mead version of it. And the difference is you're going to have honey character up front. If you're using a light honey, such as clover or alfalfa, it can be harder to get that honey character as compared if you're using a stronger honey, such as avocado or buckwheat. But basically, this is a mead version of beer. And then that brings us to the other two categories under the specialty mead. The historical mead, basically a style that does not fit into another subcategory. It's not a melomel. It has its own separate distinction. And the main two are the Ethiopian tej and then, of course, the wonderful, delicious Polish meads. And the final category is the experimental mead. Basically, a mead that it does not fit into any other category. It would not be wrong to enter it here. Obviously, if it fits better in another category, it would be better to enter it into that category rather than into the experimental mead. But any mead entry that you're not sure where it belongs, it can always be entered into the experimental mead category. And some of the examples could be bourbon barrel aged. That does not include oak barrel aging, because oak is considered acceptable in any of the other categories. So simply because you barrel aged in an oak barrel would not put it into the experimental mead category, but if it was a bourbon barrel or rye or rum barrel, then it would. Any non-traditional yeast or bacteria, so if you use Brettanomyces, if you made a sour mead, if you use non-honey fermentables such as molasses or perhaps maple syrup, and then any non-traditional processes that you want to make note of, such as bochet, would also fit in the experimental mead category. I hope that this presentation has helped you get a better understanding of what mead is, a little bit about the history of mead, and all of the wonderful variations and styles of mead that are possible for you to make. If you're going to enter competitions, I strongly encourage you to download and read the 2015 BJCP guidelines for mead. Everything that I put in there regarding the styles and categories of mead is based on those guidelines. And if you have any questions about what category your mead should be entered in, the answers are in that document. Thank you again so much for watching. Cheers.